good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Patient Engagement Open Forum session, Monitoring Patient Engagement to Learn, Increasing Intelligence Through an Integrated Strategy. Next slide, please. My name is Haley Chapman, and I am the Program Manager with Patient-Focused Medicines Development. I'm your moderator today and really looking forward to having your participation and hearing from our panelists around monitoring to learn. Next slide, please. For those of you that have attended an open forum session in the past, welcome back, and we're really glad to have your participation. And for those of you that are new, we welcome you to this global multi-stakeholder event, where we hope to provide a holistic perspective of patient engagement. And as you'll see, we'll have a number of presentations and then an opportunity as well to have a co-creation session where we look forward to your insights. Next slide, please. So as we focus specifically on this particular session today, monitoring patient engagement to learn, we're really excited to be able to share with you the progress that has been made and the evolution of the IMI paradigm monitoring and evaluation framework to what we are now referring to a beta version of the metric selector. We look forward to sharing a live demo with you about this, showing and illustrating some of the functionalities behind this tool, and really indicating how that the metric selector can help you identify and to really learn from the patient engagement initiatives that you might be engaged with from any different type of stakeholder perspective. From that point on, we will then take sort of a step back and look sort of at the bigger picture to really understand how the metric selector can be used as just one tool in a suite of number of tools and resources for a monitoring to learn strategy. This is a great opportunity as we go through our co-creation process to hear from all of you about what your needs are, what your interests are, and what can really help with a monitoring to learn strategy within your organization. So this is a great opportunity for all of you to contribute your ideas and suggestions, and also to bring an opportunity to bring all of the stakeholders together as we think about patient engagement and really looking at making some systematic change as well too. Next slide, please. So helping us with this open forum session today, we have a number of excellent panelists, and I would just ask for each of them to do a brief introduction and also address what would you like to hear more about in this particular session, whether it's from the speakers and also from the participants as we learn more about monitoring to learn. So Paula, can I ask you first?
Thank you, Haley, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. So my name is Paula Ray. I'm a senior manager for the National Institute of Health and Care Research, Applied Research Collaboration in Oxford and Thames Valley. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I've worked with patient-focused medicines development for many years and worked to embed patient engagement in all that we do. And what I'm most keen to hear about is how people see that they could use the metric selector and what the next steps would look like for them, what resources are going to be really helpful for them as they go on this evaluation journey. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Paula. And as we said before, hopefully as we move to our co-creation and insight gathering session, we'll certainly hear more about that in terms of the other resources and tools that might be useful. Michaela, over to you.
Thank you and welcome to this session and thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel. So I lead the Center of Excellence for Patient Engagement at Novartis, and the Center of Excellence essentially takes care of mostly disease-agnostic topics like governance of patient engagement, capability building for patient engagement, and very important for this session, KPI measurements of patient engagement, meaning progress as well as impact, and then also insights from patients, and then the patient engagement science. So that's the four pillars of the Center of Excellence. I was also focusing on measurements already before we had the center, including the IMI paradigm. And I'm very keen to hear how we can use measurements to really demonstrate impact, but also progress. And I would like to hear experiences from the audience about that.
Fabulous. That's great, Michaela. Thank you. And we look forward to your slides and presentations later on, particularly as we head to look towards a live demonstration of the metric selector. So Ananda, can I turn it over to you, please?
Yeah, Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. So my name is Ananda Plata. I'm a patient advocate, and I've been that since I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 25. I've led Myeloma Patients Europe as a CEO for over 10 years, and I'm now a board member of the same organization. And I'm also very involved and I'm a former chair of WECAN, which is the work group of European Cancer Patient Advocacy Networks. And I recently joined Padvocates, which is a think tank and consultancy led by patient advocates. And there I lead a unit that works on patient evidence. And what I'd like to learn, well, I mean, we've spent lots of time, I think, over the past 10 years trying to define, you know, what patient engagement is, what meaningful patient engagement is, and then suddenly saw that measuring success was key to ensure patient engagement, but that it wasn't easy at all. And so I'm really excited to learn more about being able to measure impact, being able to measure success, especially when, you know, when it comes to meaningful patient engagement. Because, well, I think in the end, only it's only meaningful if you're really able to impact in a positive way the lives of patients.
Great. Thanks so much, Ananda. And we look forward to hearing your perspective as well, too, certainly representing the patient community and the importance, again, of measuring. And as you indicated, certainly not an easy task, but we hope that this first step forward with the metric selector certainly heads in the right direction with that as well, too. Barry, can I turn it over to you, please, in terms of an introduction and what you're looking forward to in this session?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Haley. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I'm Director of Public Policy at the University of Southern California's Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. That's where we're a think tank where we measurably improve value and health through evidence-based policy solutions. I came to the space of patient engagement in my role as Vice President of Patient Engagement at Edwards Life Sciences, where I left there a couple months ago. But I established the patient engagement function at Edwards, and I had to establish metrics, KPI, various measurements of value and progress in that function as I tried to justify the investment that we were able to successfully get from the company into our patient engagement program at Edwards. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all whether or not the ideas that we have in terms of our strategy going forward is going to work. You know, help us pressure test what can and cannot work, what kind of challenges we need to overcome, because I think it's really critical to the success of patient engagement that we figure out ways to better measure what we do and how to improve our performance in this area.
Great. Thanks so much, Barry, and looking forward to hearing your perspective as well, too, certainly. On the next slide, you'll see in terms of the agenda for today's session, as we've mentioned, each of the panelists here will have 10 minutes or so to present some slides, some information to share with all of you. We'll have 10 minutes for a Q&A following that, and then we'll move on to our insight gathering and our co-creation activity as well, too. So a few quick housekeeping rules to keep in mind, as I'm sure everybody is very familiar with this at this point. You'll see on the next slide a couple of things that we ask, first of all, clearly that you be present and engaged and using the chat function or using the Q&A function within the Zoom webinar as well too. Chat to be used, obviously, if you have some comments or resources that you might like to share with everybody on the call today. Q&A, obviously directing some questions that can be answered and hope to be addressed during our Q&A session following each of the speakers. You recognize as well too that the session will be recorded and that the microphones will be muted during the session as well too. On the next slide, we'll just see briefly in terms of just highlighting where you can add your questions in the Q&A function. We encourage you to upvote a question if you have the same question in mind. And while unfortunately not all of the questions will be able to be answered live, we will do our best to follow up afterwards to make sure that you have the responses that you're looking for as well too. So So moving on to the next slide, we will be using the GroupMap platform. Again, many of you are probably quite familiar with GroupMap at this point. We do encourage you to use a computer with it, using the platform. And we have the first question in terms of being able to for you to log on to GroupMap and to provide a quick response. We'll provide the link in the chat, so you can click on the link and follow through the instructions. You will need to enter your email address. And the first question that we have for the day is just if you could indicate what stakeholder group that you represent. So we can move on to the next slide, please. And so this is what you should see when you arrive onto GroupMap. And on the next slide as well too, you can see the link there. And if you could enter into GroupMap now, we've shared the link in the chat. And so just take a minute to log on to GroupMap, enter your stakeholder group. We'll just give you 30 seconds or so to move forward with that. And then we'll kick off with the speakers as well too. If there's any questions, any issues with logging on to GroupMap, please don't hesitate to address that in chat as well. And thank you. So I see that a number of people are joining. And we'll just give it another 30 seconds or so. And if we could switch over to the results. Great, thank you. So we can see that we have strong representation from industry, obviously from the patient community as well too, whether that be representation from a patient organization or patients themselves, which is terrific. Really glad to have everybody here. Healthcare professionals as well. So we'll leave it like that for now. Feel free, if you haven't had a chance to log on yet or to indicate your stakeholder participation, please feel free to do that. We will be operating GroupMap and the presentations and the Zoom together. And so don't log out of GroupMap yet. We will be coming back to that after we've had the presentations. So if we can go back to the slides again. So we can turn it over to Paula. So again, turn it over to Paula, who will give us another indication in terms of the evolution from the paradigm monitoring and evaluation framework to the metric selector. And I will reconnect with all of you again following the presentations and for the Q&A. Thanks very much, Paula. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Hayley. And next slide, please. So Paradigm was an alliance funded by the IMI program to develop tools and resources to strengthen patient engagement. And one of the key outputs from that was a monitoring and evaluation framework. The idea was to support learning to facilitate meaningful engagement, help users understand their pathways, but actually to evidence the decision making. And one of the key elements of the tool was to actually have discussions between the two groups, the patients, the researchers and the organization, to really make sure that we're all working together. And it's quite a good way to then be able to self-evaluate the progress and the impacts of your patient engagement. Next slide, please. So last year at the Patient Engagement Forum, we talked about where Paradigm had got to with the monitoring and evaluation framework and presented the history and the development of that. And what was really great at that session was that we had really good interaction with the participants as to what we needed next. So the tool is currently an Excel spreadsheet, which is quite difficult to navigate. It's got 87 metrics in it. While it has got scenarios that people could follow, it was felt that we needed something much more interactive, something that people could develop according to their own context. It was also felt to be really important that this is not another initiative, that it really is embedded with the patient engagement planning tool, the quality criteria that have been so well developed through patient-focused medicine's development. And that some of the other preferred things were things like having standard sets of metrics for different scenarios and more detailed explanations. And I think we'll find that we're going to get to those points, but we're not quite there yet. Next slide, please. So as with everything patient-focused medicines development does, a co-creation working group was pulled together, including people from the Paradigm team, patient associations, patient representatives, industry representatives, and wider researchers, just to understand how this was going to translate. And it was important we had the Paradigm team there, that we didn't lose any of the rigor from the work that they'd done. They extracted all the metrics, the 87 metrics from the published literature around patient engagement to show what people had been using in the past, and then grouped it into the different stages. So we've got your inputs, your outputs, and your impacts. And it was important we maintained all of that. And there was a whole process, as I say, of how we then validated those metrics in comparison to the patient engagement quality criteria, and how we made this into a usable tool. Next slide, please. So this is where we are, sort of midpoint in our journey. So as mentioned, we've already developed the metric selector with a lot of input from our partners and stakeholders. We launched it internally for the patient-focused medicines network, and just to get that initial feedback, was it doing everything that we said we wanted it to do? Can you select different filters? You don't have to use all the filters. I'll come on to that in a minute. And then we took on board all the feedback, and this is where we are today. We're opening up now to a much broader public consultation and launch. And the idea is that this isn't the end of the process. We're going to continue to iteratively develop the tool. We can see there's an awful lot of potential as more and more people use other metrics, that we could embed them in. We could provide some form of benchmarking, expectations around patient engagement for different scenarios, and to integrate it further into the other systems like the Synapse, so we can create something that we can all learn from and develop. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Right, so this one is just a screenshot of the tool, and Michaela in a minute is going to go through it in more detail as how you use it. But just wanted to give you sort of an overview of some of the key elements of it. So firstly, we have the filters. So down the left-hand side, you've got the different filters. The first one here is the purpose. Now, actually, for me, that's one of the most important things. And in the introductions, everyone mentioned it from their different perspectives. So Barry mentioned that you want to justify the investment in patient engagement and continue that justification, that allocation of resources. Amanda mentioned that it was a positive benefit for patients. You want to know that you're having those positive impacts. So that's, your rationale. But a lot of people want it for the quality improvement elements. We know patient engagement is so important. We now just need to improve it and develop it further. So the other filters, as I mentioned, you don't need all the filters. The other filters include stages in the development, stakeholder group, and of course the quality criteria. You can see there's a progression of monitoring how many of the metrics you've selected. The idea is that for each filter you select, it will give you a number of the 87, and that will compile, and you'll get a list that answers all the filters that you put in. And then you'll get an additional list that will be related ones that you might also want to consider. So as you can see here, there's a full description of the metrics, but also some suggestions as to how you can measure them. Some of them are very quantitative, so number of participants in a focus group, feedback surveys. And this is an area that we feel was going to develop as more and more people use it. They share how they're monitoring and evaluating, what indicators they're using for each of the metrics, but also some signposting to other resources. And it's really important that sometimes you want to have you do need to have a discussion once you've selected a list of metrics. As Michaela is going to show, you could have a long list, but you still actually then want to focus in, actually, these are the key performance indicators we want to extract and we want to work to, because you could be making jobs for jobs rather than actually what you need to get the outputs for. And next one, please. So, and because this is a public consultation, but also this is further evolving, all your feedback is really critical. So that it's been embedded within the tool that we can capture your feedback as we go. And I think the last bit is the fact that, yes, there will be other suggested metrics that you might want to also consider this. And that will be, as we'll learn from this, as the more people use it, what if people have selected the same filters as you, these are the metrics they then went on to use. And we hope the tool will refine. Next slide, please. So really it is a 3-step process. The filters help you understand what's important, why you want to do it, what are the key elements, what stages in the life cycle you're at, and to have those discussions in partnership with all your stakeholders to understand what what we're going to focus on, because you might get a list of 20 metrics that's not feasible to measure, but actually there are these 3 that are key that we need to take forward. You might want across an organization a set of metrics that every project measures, but then some have some more tailoring. You then have the opportunity to explore not only the metrics that have come up as the most beneficial based on the information you've put in, but you can also find new ways that you can develop key performance indicators. And finally, you can select your set of potential metrics and review that with your organization, your stakeholders, to then make that informed choice of how you're going to do it and what you're hopefully going to get from it. So next slide, please. And I'll pass over now to Michaela, who's going to show us how she's used it in her organization to help use those metrics to define the key performance indicators for a given piece of work. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you, Paula. And what you will see or hear from me is we'll take the steps from the strategy of selecting the metrics to real implementation. And we will go through that first in the conceptual way, and then we will see a live demo. So if we can move to the next slide, I will talk a little bit on how you can use the metric selector and what it's designed for. But I want to look back also to last year where you gave all feedback into the metrics. And what you see here is actually the applied implementation of the feedback. And therefore also the encouragement that when we later on work on the obtaining of more feedback, please share your feedback. As you can see, it gets heard and it gets also implemented. So how can you use the metric selector? First of all, it allows really a broad selection for an activity, for different kinds of activities. And if you saw it in the small print, it's also mentioned there's 87 potential metrics in the tool. And then it allows you to really select based on the specifics of your activity. It also allows you a selection of a multitude of KPIs and or measurements. So you're not carved in stone with a specific set, but you can really tailor your measurements or your KPIs to either your organization or to the specific focus of the activity that you're looking into. The third element that is important, it is applied, or it can be applied to a broad variety of situations. And I will show you that it is even broader than what you can read on the tool. You can sometimes take a liberal interpretation of what the matrix is and then apply it to even more situations. And situations also stands for different stakeholders. So this is not a tool for one specific stakeholder, but really for all stakeholders that may be interested and may want to measure patient engagement or put KPIs. It is, as said already, based on different segmentation criteria so that you can tailor it to what your needs are and what your criteria are, because they may differ depending on the activity or also depending on the organization that you are with or the stakeholder that you represent. And then last but not least, it provides the flexibility to really be applied to a multitude of activities, even if they are not specifically designed in the tool. For example, I will be using certain elements that appear as clinical trials, and I will just apply them to a commercial setting. And with that, we can go to my example. And the example is on the next slide. It's what I'm trying to do here is I want to measure metrics on a patient support program. So patient support programs are typically programs that often industry runs and means to support patients. in their treatments, but also in their adherence, or any other services or help the patients may need. That's what the support program would be for. And my objective in this measurement is really to understand the needs of patients and then make sure that those needs get implemented into the design elements of such a support program. And then I would like to measure if it really meets the needs of patients, if the materials are in patient language, or if the patients are really well informed by the program. So that's what the elements that potentially I would like to measure in such a program. Why do I want to do that? Is because in a patient support program, you obviously want to support program where it matters and really depend those decisions on the needs of patients. And that's important also because only then we can count on the use of the patients of this program. So it really represents support, but it also is effective investment. So we're not investing in a program that later on may not meet the needs of patients and therefore doesn't get used, and therefore the investment is sunk costs. So my expectations from measurement is I would like to really create learning on the needs. I want to measure if the feedback is implemented, and then also if the implementation has an impact, and if the learning is shared back. We spoke about measurement for the purpose of learning, so we really want to learn from patients and then share back. So what I've done here is I said, okay, for the purpose of this matrix selection, I would use 3 sets of the segmentation criteria. I would focus on the purpose of the evaluation, in this case, accountability and analysis. I would also want to reflect the stakeholder group here, in this case, industry and patient community. And I would want to know which quality criteria I could use. And I've selected respect and accessibility, a shared purpose, which for this purpose of such a program would be highly important. Also, if the stakeholders are representative, and then if there is transparency in this program. So assuming that I have select all these segmentation criteria, what I would then get from the tool is what you see on the next slide, which is a selection of proposed matrix output. And you can see here I have selected 5, and one of them is, for example, the understanding of the patient experience and if the preferences are reflected. That's one that would be an obvious for such a program. The second one is the number of patients or contributors in a research article. So I would use this as an example of how you can broaden the scope of the metric selector and say, okay, I want to know, or I use this criteria as the number of patients that are represented in my patient support program. So basically I use the criteria, but I broaden it to my purpose of my measurement. And the same would be true for the next matrix, which is the degree to which outcomes, measures and endpoints of a trial are patient-centric. I would apply that same notion to my patient support program and say to which degree is the support program really patient-centric and focused on patient needs. And then I continue and look into the number of members of patient organizations. And then again, another example, the number of clinical trials changing the inclusion or exclusion. Here I would apply it to patient support, which is the number of elements of the input that we've received from patients end up being implemented in the patient support program. What you see here very nicely as well is what Paula mentioned already. There are always related metrics that get proposed by the tool. And there I've selected 3 additional ones that were not in my mind originally, and I have integrated them into my measurement framework. So when you're finished with the selector, basically what the end product is a group of selected metrics that you can use then for measuring your activity. And without any further ado, we can then move into a live demo, and I will show you within the tool, and I will get from Magda some help on navigating the tool. In the tool, we will do now live what I've just shown you on the slide as an output. And you see the tool here. So the first thing you would go and do is what I just explained. You would come up and say, okay, which are the segmentation criteria I would want to use. So I said, I want to use the purpose of the evaluation. I want to also use the stakeholder group, industry and patient community, and I want to use the quality criteria. And then we said, And then what you see is in the tool very nicely, we have moved from 87 potential metrics into 10 metrics, which is the output then of the tool. And you see on the side as well, I see a number of related metrics that the tool proposes to me that I can take a look at and say, okay, do I want to measure the accessibility of the language? Maybe that's a good idea for my program, or the preparatory material, sorry, is something that I could measure. Or also maybe the change in awareness and knowledge about the patient needs. Here, that will be an internal measurement. So I look through the related metrics and can then select additional metrics from there. So that's what the tool allows you to do. And that will be then the output. And you can see I've moved from 87 to 10. And then I can download this matrix. And I can take this downloaded matrix to my team meeting, to my stakeholder meeting, and get an agreement. Okay, out of the 10, do we really want all of them? Out of the related ones, are there some that I would like to adopt? So once you have downloaded that, you can then take that to your team meeting, and you can look and explore and see how the matrix are being included. Again, we are going through the matrix as I did before on the slide. You would then read through the definitions of the matrix, and then you would click and select. For example, here again, I said the number of patients cited as authors. I chose that one knowing that it won't be authors, but it would really be the number of contributors to the PSP, or potentially at the end, maybe a publication as well. So that's how you select all the different KPIs that you want to apply to your specific program. So at the end of this exercise, what you then have is the end result, which is what I had shown earlier on the slide. One thing to mention as well is on the side of each matrix, you would always see color-coded the purpose or the segmentation criteria that you have used, and you will always be able to orient yourself on the criteria and the segmentation that you've taken. So that is the work that you would do, and then you would download. So once you download the selected matrix, you have basically the tool in hand that you can use in your team meeting, and you can take for your further discussion. And the end result then of such a discussion would be that you go and select, after exploring, you go and select the final matrix. And once you have selected the final matrix, you would end up with what we had on the slide that I showed you earlier on, moving out of the 10 suggested one into 5 final metrics that we have decided on, assuming that it's a team decision, and out of the suggested related metrics, the 3 that I had shown you previously on the slide. So that's how you would basically finish your work on selecting. And we can move to the next slide, basically away from the demonstration to the final output. As I said, you would have selected the final output, and then you would work with your team. Now, what we can do today, and what you will find also in the program of today, the purpose is to get further input from all of you. And you see here there is a tool. The tool is accessible via the PFMD platform, and there is the public consultation starting now. So we will really invite you all to give your feedback, to also put in your questions, your ideas. As you have seen earlier on, the tool has really taken the input from a broad audience last year, and we would like to do the same here and today, get further feedback on what else could be done, but also how we can further evolve the tool so that it really meets your needs. So with that, we can then move to the last slide of this presentation, and just to end up on what the final result would be from a matrix selector. It can be used for selecting the matrix for your own activity, but it can also be elevated to a high-level scale and really be used for selecting the matrix for really driving organizational change. How would you do that? First of all, you would do what we've just done. You would select meaningful metrics for your activities, but then you would also make sure that it is being shared across the organization, and that this monitoring is being shared within the organization, so that you can share how it adds value and also create a learning culture. You would then also make sure that the matrix monitoring happens, that you use the matrix to communicate basically within your organization, not only in your activities, but within your organization. Make the organization understand how you measure, but also what the output is, and then measure the trends, the progress over time. And that progress over time also helps you to communicate the value that was mentioned earlier on. And you can also look into exploring what is most used and therefore most helpful potentially. And you can then use it also for organizational reporting. You can share the matrix, you can share the progress within the organization, so it becomes a communication tool. It also can become a benchmarking tool. You can compare your matrix within your organization, but also within your different activities. And then the key point in order to have impact is really draw conclusions. What have we learned from the measurement, and how do we take that learning then into evolution of the organization? Benchmark across the organization to create further learning. And I would add to that, benchmark across the organization and also over time. Because when you measure over time and you compare your trends within the organization over time, you really create learning and impact. So that would be the elevation of moving from a matrix, from an activity to really organizational learning from the matrix and from the measurements across an organization. And with that, I would like to end here and hope and hand over to Ananda, who will talk a bit more about the impact of patient engagement and the patient perspective. Ananda, over to you.
Thanks, Michaela. Well, today, next slide, please. Today, I've been asked to cover the patient perspective of measuring patient engagement and the impact that we can have on the patient community by doing so. And here, I really thought that it would be useful to maybe take a step back and to go through the definition of patient engagement and really what it is in our eyes from a patient community point of view. I'd then like to touch upon the challenge that we as a patient community experience when it comes to meaningful patient engagement, and to really talk about or identify whether there's anything that stands in the way, or is there anything that makes patient engagement difficult from our point of view. I'll then go into naming a couple of potential ways that we've identified at MPE to measure meaningful patient engagement. And lastly, I've been asked to present a couple of examples of what impact could look like for the patient community. Next slide. And so in order to be able to measure success when it comes to patient engagement, one has to try and go back to the concept of, a meaningful definition. And really a lot has been said about this concept. However, sometimes it drifts to higher spheres when you don't stay in touch with the patient community when having those discussions about measuring and so on. So really far away from where the impact actually needs to be felt, that is with the patient. And so how does meaningful patient engagement look like for the patient community? And I've listed a couple of things of what it is. And you can see here that we understand it as a systematic selection of individuals by the patient community to be part of that process, to being able to actually shape research, not only being involved at the end, to be involved right at the beginning where you can influence and shape that outcome of research. Being informed about deadlines in advance, so you know exactly when that input or that engagement should be taking place. The fact that your input is actually incorporated is a huge issue. That the involvement is systematic. And so I think that was mentioned by Michaela before about that organizational change. I think that's very important. It cannot depend on individuals, that the involvement happens on a regular basis. And more important, I would say, even than actually incorporating the feedback or whatever the patient brings to the table every time. It is about feeding back whenever that input hasn't been incorporated, so you can understand why that's happened, and really to incorporate patient preferences and quality of life into that whole process. And what it isn't is really a tick box exercise, which is something that we see very often, starting to involve patients in phase 3 when you know that the regulatory phase is coming nearer. Also ad hoc involvement or engagement rather than regular involvement, or the cherry picking of individuals by the company rather than having a conversation with the patient community, the organization in the area, so to identify the individuals that are best suited for that particular task. Then also what it's not is involving individuals based on relationship rather than the competencies that they have. Also something that unfortunately we see and that it is a bit of a threat to the whole process is involving different individuals every time that you make patient engagement happen. So there's no group learning of what is happening. And then obviously involving patients or engaging them when those decisions have been made already and you're actually only signing off what has already been decided. Well, when that feedback has been given and it hasn't been incorporated, and then there's no explanation as to why that has happened. Next slide. Well, but despite, all the patient centricity and, everyone being aligned, as we can see, on, the need of patient engagement to truly happen, we still encounter big challenges when trying to put in place meaningful patient engagement in the patient community, or from the patient community side. And one example of this, a very good example, is the timing, because we know, it's well known that, the earlier patient engagement happens, the more impact we're likely to get out of it. However, that makes things more complex at that moment in time, and there's different reasons for why it doesn't happen. Not all of them understandable, but some of them are. The patient community very often gets involved, if they get involved, in a phase 3, when actually, there's very little opportunity to shape the outcome of that research. Next slide. But there are other challenges, besides the timing, strangely, they all coincide with the first slide, the don't slide that I had at the beginning, which, is why I'm not going to go through them, but you can look at them later on to see which these are. Next. And it's not like we haven't, looked for ways to measure impact and monitor how well, we're ensuring that meaningful patient engagement happens. I've tried to list some of the KPIs that we, innocently have come up in the community advisory board setting at Myeloma Patients Europe. And you can see here, some of them are, the number of times when input was incorporated and really led to changes, the proportion of trials in which engagement happened before phase 3, the proportion of individuals providing input that are regional, so where the trial actually happens and not only from the US, the proportion of advisory boards where the umbrella organization or the organization in the field had a say in who would attend them, the proportion of studies versus the total where actually patient engagement happened. well, the studies where quality of life and PROs were measured in the right way, well, patients had a say, had a look at them to verify that they were measured in the appropriate way. Endpoints, in which of those has the patient community had a say, the time between the first and the last patient recruited, because it's something that we very often don't see, but actually when patient engagement happens, there's time saved. The number of dropouts, we believe, and withdrawal of consent can be reduced importantly when patient engagement happens in a meaningful way. And the number of protocol amendments as well, we feel can be decreased. So all of these things are areas that can be measured, where impact can be measured. Whether we've been successful or not, I can tell you later on. Next slide. And here really on how that impact could look in reality. Well, I mean, there's different forms of success when it comes to meaningful patient engagement. I think anything really that could make a patient's life better as a result of engaging the community is already a success, I would say. It could be that, for instance, quality of life, you know, after that engagement, quality of life is now being measured you know, with a more adapted tool, or at the right moment in time, or you know, often enough or long enough, and that leads to reflecting the true situation of the patient. But there are others, as you can see, examples like, for instance, a trial that now includes a more appropriate patient population, or that a trial's endpoint is now more meaningful for patients, that there's options for crossover, for instance, understandable informed consents, that clinical trials are run in remote or, you know, maybe commercially not so interesting countries, that the benefit risk ratio from a patient point of view is included in the value proposition that is handed on to the regulators and HTA bodies. Well, lower dropouts of the study participants because, you know, they don't withdraw their consent. Also the fact that, you know, recruitment happens faster, because when patient engagement happens, we have the hypothesis that patients feel safer, and this obviously saves resources and time, so win-win. And then, as I mentioned before, so the number of protocol amendments, that is lower. And I mean, there's still a very long way, we think, to go until we really find a good way to measure success, although we've seen that there's plenty progress, and I'm very keen to look at that tool with the myeloma community to see and to criticize and to test it, and to see whether it's applicable for us as well. So I think that there's still a long way to go to measure success in the area of patient engagement, but it certainly, this session shows that we're going in the right direction, and we just need to be very careful. And probably my main message here, careful that the whole process stays close, remains in touch with the most important element of patient engagement, which is the patient. And with that, I pass on to Barry to take a step back and review monitoring and learn strategy.
Thanks so much, Ananda. And by far, your voice, the patient voice, is the most important here in the room. So we really appreciate your perspective and insights and some great examples. I'm going to go over kind of what our task is here. You're all going to be put to work. This is not just one of those webinars where you log in and then do your email while you're kind of half listening outside one ear. This is something where we're really depending upon you to help us move this initiative forward. So I'm going to kind of set the stage and help us, as Ananda mentioned, pull back a little bit and get kind of to, all right, where does this monitoring, where does this tool fit in our monitoring to learn strategy? So if you can advance to the next slide, please. So, and click forward once. So where we are with this metric selector is we think of it in the way that we've developed based on input from the community, from all of you or representatives like you, that this piece of measurement needs to be a part of a broader strategy. And so where this fits is at the, I wouldn't say, it's really the foundational level. It's where we're operating on a day-to-day basis. I think Gandhi is attributed with saying, if you want to change the world, change yourself. And that's kind of where I think we want to start, is where can we, as patient engagement ambassadors in our respective organizations, work to ensure that we are proactively testing these techniques out. If we're going to ask our industry or society to be held accountable for patient engagement, let's make sure that we can do that with ourselves first. So next click. So this initiative is really, one more click, please, is at this, right now, this early stage, this foundational level. And our vision is, next click, as you go up in terms of the, one more click, sorry, as you go up in terms of the different kinds of measurement tools or measurement, let's call them territories, we may be then able to use them more frequently and actually have leadership within our organizations depend upon these, incorporate these into their own operations. If you can go up to the next level. And ultimately what we expect is that this will be something that we hope can be developed for almost sector level evaluation and measurement. Think of it as almost a grading system, maybe, that organizations can use to compare each other's performance, maybe get a little healthy competition going in between either various industries or players within a sector. So if you can go to the next slide. Where we think that this broader monitoring to learn strategy needs to go right now is, you've heard a bit about this metric selector. That's the first bucket over here on the left-hand side. And we want to start to get some ideas from you as to what else do we need to develop as a community to make sure that this approach is adopted. And I'll give you a quick example. There were a couple of questions in the chat. Great discussion going on in there. Thank you all for participating and getting involved and staying engaged. I think that there's some questions as to how exactly would you measure performance on a certain KPI. What's the tool, the actual, let's say maybe it's a survey instrument. What does that survey instrument look like? Sometimes getting the details down in terms of the literal tools that we use can really make a big difference in terms of the momentum inside an organization. That's what we're all here to try to do at PFMD and the partners here, to try to figure out where do we want to focus our collective resources to try to provide you with the kinds of tools and training or whatever you think we need to make sure that this can be as effective as possible. And as I mentioned, ultimately at some point, we do want to have this vision for future tools and maybe scorecards or techniques for really ensuring that patient engagement is a part of maybe organizations' sustainability programs. At Edwards Life Sciences, where I was, that's one of the things that we were successful at doing, was incorporating clinical trial metrics like what was just shared, Ananda just shared, about our progress in incorporating patient perspectives into the design of our clinical trials. We incorporated that into our public sustainability program at Edwards, and that's really moving it, I think, much further than a lot of organizations are ready to go yet. So what do we need to do to make sure that we can help organizations get more familiar with this and more comfortable with doing it? So with that, I think that's kind of the setup for our next step here, which will be to go into, first of all, some discussion. I think Haley's going to take over amongst the panelists here and answer any questions before we then go into the work. We're going to put you to work and hopefully find the best nuggets of information out there that we have yet to discover.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barry, for that overview and for taking that step back, encouraging our audience to think beyond just the metric selector. And thank you to Paula, Michaela, and Ananda as well for sharing your perspectives. Ananda, obviously from the community, from the patient community, and Michaela and Paula from sharing some additional thoughts about the metric selector. We have a few minutes for some Q&A now, some questions that we have received from the audience as well. Before I take a bit of a deeper dive into some of those, again, just responding to some of the comments that Barry made, that within the chat, there's been some good dialogue and some good discussion there as well. And a reminder, because I think there's been a few questions around, what are the specific metrics or the type of evaluation that I could use for a particular metric. And I just encourage everybody in the audience as well, that when you have an opportunity to access the metric selector and play around with it a little bit, you'll understand that there are some suggestions that are made around how can different metrics be measured, what are some of the related metrics, as Michaela pointed out as well too. And so, and again, as was iterated in the chat, this is accessible to anybody and everybody that is wanting to be able to be part of the open consultation. So it's not just limited to those involved with patient engagement. And certainly it's, of course, free of charge as well too. So just wanting to make sure that everybody's clear on that. And now potentially, as we move to some of the specific questions, I'd like to think, Paula, first of all, in terms of some of the information that you shared and obviously the evaluation itself as it relates to the metric selector, using the KPIs, using the metrics, those 87 metrics that were put forward by Paradigm. What can people do in terms of moving beyond just looking at metrics and KPIs, but ensuring that the evaluation process is meaningful and purposeful and provides some additional feedback as well too? Can you just share some thoughts on that?
Yes, so sort of the key thing is how the metrics are derived, because actually if you're only focusing on the organizational perspectives, you're going to get sort of one set of metrics, but oftentimes it's when you have the discussions that you can understand that actually positive impact is what we're talking about, but we obviously recognize that we have negative impacts. But what we're looking for from a organization, from a company's point of view, may be very different from a patient's point of view. But actually by having those discussions, you suddenly, hopefully people will recognize that there are different impacts that we can be measuring. And it also plays to then, how do you measure? Because as I mentioned, a lot of the metrics in the tool are very quantitative. They'll tell you how many people have been involved, how many people have shaped it, but they won't tell you whether they were the right people for that project, or whether, that they did actually shape it just because they were in attendance. So I think for us, that's the next step in this, is then to start to add that scrutiny to, okay, if that's what we're trying to show, what does that mean from a patient perspective, from an organization's perspective? And then you'll get better outputs.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Paula. And I think, as you mentioned, that was something that was really important in terms of having that ongoing dialogue and that conversation to really strengthen those partnerships and those relationships as well too, whether it be between industry, patient organizations, or other stakeholders as well. And maybe Ananda, to hear from your perspective then as well around representing the patient community, now that you've had a chance to see the metric selector, hear some of the discussion as well too. How do you think the patient community, a patient organization would be able to use the metric selector in terms of, we saw the demonstration from Michaela from industry, and just would be interested in your insights and reflections from the patient community side.
Well, I don't know. I haven't tested it, to be honest. But as I said, I'm really keen to do so. I think, well, it has to be flexible enough for very different and heterogeneous patient communities to be able to use it, because some are very professional and have a long history of patient engagement, and some are very new to it. I think if the tool could also provide, I mean, I'm making this up, but if the tool could also provide a way of making the relationship with the company that you engage with more systematic, more organizational, rather than dependent on the individual that is sitting on the other side, that would be extremely helpful, because we struggle a lot with that. And then, I don't know, I mean, there's many dimensions that aren't very specific to the metrics as such, because we would have to look in detail as to, you know, what we think about that. But I think the organizational dimension is a very important one. And probably if I may say, the compliance hurdles that we experience on the patient side are also a challenge and a barrier to proper patient engagement. And so, independently of what the tool says and what metrics it spits out, if you then have someone sitting in the legal department that doesn't understand what you're trying to do, that's a huge problem. And so I think we need to think about that as well, as to, you know, we sitting in this virtual room truly believe in this project, but it has to go beyond. It has to not only be communicated to the company, it has to be understood and lived by people that have nothing to do with patient advocacy or patient engagement.
Yeah, absolutely, Ananda. Thank you for that. And I think that's one of the things that in a few minutes we'll just turn over to the insight gathering, and to try to understand that, yes, the metric selector is a fantastic tool and can really help to answer some questions as it relates to metrics and to KPIs, but it's not the only tool or the only resource that's needed in terms of really developing further that monitoring to learn strategy within an organization, and what are some of the gaps or some of the needs being expressed by other stakeholders, as you just did, around some other resources or supports that are needed to further engage with a monitoring to learn strategy beyond just the patient engagement department or consideration as well too. There's a couple of questions in the chat here, and specifically there's one question for you, Ananda, here in terms of some of the compliance issues, and I just want to acknowledge that I've seen that question and that you had referenced as well. And if I may, I'd like to just come back to that as part of our insight gathering when we talk about some of the challenges. So perhaps we can just hold on that question, give you some time to think it through, and can come back to it later in the group map as well. But Michaela, turning to you now too, I mean, Ananda has talked about from the patient community perspective, how the selector may be beneficial, how it might be useful, and also for the potential of some of the challenges to be able to embed that within an organization. Barry talked a little bit as well about taking that step back beyond just looking at KPIs for an activity or an initiative, but then also thinking about at a company or an organization level. And I'm interested to hear from your perspective, what would the difference be in the types of KPIs or the metrics that you would consider at an initiative level versus at a broader, larger perspective as we think about organizations and companies, or as well from patient organizations too?
Yeah, I think there's two things to consider. The first thing I would say is starting to measure is already the first big step. If you start measuring and putting KPIs in place in a concerted effort across activities, it puts a lot of weight on the patient engagement work, because what you measure also gets the attention and then communicates that it's important. That is the first step, and sometimes I have seen it's not so important. Also, I put a big caveat on that. Sometimes it's not so important what exactly you measure, but the fact that you have started measuring. Now, when you move from measuring individual activities to an organizational measurement, the key importance I would see is in having a set of criteria or KPIs that are applicable to a broad variety of activities, so that when you measure from an organizational perspective, you're basically measuring the aggregate. So if you take the example that I have shown, the patient input into a patient support program, you could equally apply that to a clinical program or a clinical trial. if you not just measure on one clinical trials, but you start measuring in how many clinical trials you have done that, then you're really elevating it into an organizational measurement. And then the second step is very much linked to what Ananda said in terms of what the patient community would like to see. It is very often also in line and in the same purpose as the industry would see. And I would say it only makes sense if you apply those KPIs. Just to mention, Ananda said that from a patient perspective, the number of times that input is collected, I would apply that to an organization, how many clinical trials have had patient input, and then take it to the next step. And so how many of these inputs were actually integrated. And then I would link it to what the final impact is from a patient perspective. It's also from an industry perspective. Now, if you have more adherence in a clinical trial, more accessibility, which leads to more diversity in a clinical trial. So in essence, if you aggregate the individual activity KPI measurements across the organization in a unified way, then you move up to an organizational measurement. The second element that I would like to add is when we measure, we should also communicate. I think that's the second very important element, to communicate the impact, the measurements themselves, but also the impact. It's a fantastic communication tool, and it's sometimes underused.
Yes, absolutely, Michaela. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. And I can see in the chat, obviously, there's some people agreeing there with you as well. Just a quick reference to the chat and to the Q&A. I see people have provided some additional insights and input, particularly from the patient community perspective, which is obviously, as Barry mentioned as well, and as we recognize, very important, and why we're doing this as well too, to ensure that patient engagement certainly is embedded within organizations. There's been some suggestions and comments in terms of the metric selector itself, and I really encourage everybody that when we share the link with the open consultation, that you provide that feedback and let us know, let the co-creation group understand and better be able to suit the needs of all the stakeholders, particularly from the patient community. So if there's suggestions, things that you like, things that you don't like for whatever reason, let us know and see how we can address some of those suggestions and ideas as well. Barry, I'll turn the last question to you in terms of sort of bridge that gap a little bit between looking at the metric selector, looking at KPIs and metrics at the initiative, the activity level, and then as Michaela has shared with us from an organization level, what else needs to be considered as well too. You mentioned in your introduction that you had done your time with Edwards Life Sciences, that you had been considering KPIs and looking at various metrics. And I guess my question to you would be, if you were able to take a step back and look at a monitoring to learn strategy, whether it's from your experience with Edwards, perhaps now with USC, or based on what the panelists have shared, what would be your I guess, definition of success as you looked at a monitoring to learn strategy? How could an organization look at that, and what sort of should we be aiming towards in terms of success with a monitoring to learn strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really is important for us to focus on the learning component of this as opposed to the more kind of critical, let's call it evaluation perspective. And that is that, to me, success is an organization, whether it's a patient group or a company, learns, oh, this type of activity tends to work better than that activity. And we can then prioritize our focus. Not to say we're not going to do it, it's just let's figure out which one works better. And we get better at increasing our patient engagement. But separately, I think this is a key element to this, and it's a big passion of mine, is that you can develop all the best metrics there are in the world, but if you don't have internal stakeholders who have real buy-in into whether or not those are legitimate metrics that really will drive ultimate behavior, you're never going to get adoption. You're always going to have criticisms after the fact. Oh, well, that metric, that was a lead indicator as opposed to a lag indicator, or whatever kind of nonsense that executives, whether you're at a corporation or at a patient organization, might throw in your way. So I think that getting that internal buy-in is important, and it's really key to set up the whole experience and the whole effort as more about we're trying to learn. We're trying to improve what we're doing. It's not we're trying to justify our existence or we're trying to evaluate whether or not we're going to cut that part of the budget. It's more about we want to learn what seems to work best.
Yeah, absolutely, Barry. Thank you. And I think with that, then you've given us a good segue to transition over to our co-creation session. And so again, if we can share the group map link in the chat for those of you that may not yet have had a chance to log in to group map. And then if I can ask our team to also share the group map as well so that we can see the questions. For those of you that are familiar with group map, you'll know that there'll be a number of we have 3 questions to be able to share, and we'll walk through one at a time. Please, all of you out in the audience, please feel free to input your comments, your suggestions, your ideas as well too. So our first question here is really thinking about, in addition to the metric selector and thinking really about what Barry has been speaking about, going sort of beyond just a metric selector, what other resources and tools are needed within an organization, whether it be from the patient perspective, whether it be within industry, potentially within regulatory and HTA bodies in terms of patient engagement? What other tools and resources are really needed to really provide an opportunity for learning and for that feedback and increasing that patient engagement intelligence? So you're welcome to input your responses in the appropriate sections, whether you represent the patient community or a patient organization, from the industry side as well too. So we're looking at as well from the regulatory and the HTA bodies, and from other stakeholders as well too. So I'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to input some ideas there, some suggestions. And certainly to our panelists too, as you see ideas or suggestions popping up, then please feel free to comment or question as well too.
Maybe, Haley, I can pick up on one element that I see under patient organizations, and I would apply that also to industry. So it says that we should share more best practice examples or examples. And I would say from an industry perspective, but not only industry perspective, I think it's equally applicable to regulatory and HTA bodies, is really demonstrating impact. So publications on impact, on how was the patient input implemented, and what did it lead to? So again, connecting the input with the final output and the impact. I think that's important. On the industry side, I saw return on investment and net present value. That's the way we would express it. Very often, I think you can also express it in a qualitative fashion in publications where we share how the input led to faster trials or faster recruitment, better adherence, or better trial diversity.
Great. Thanks, Michaela. Interesting perspective. I'm just having a quick look at the chat too, because there's a number of questions that have come through here. I see some questions about some of the strategies to overcome some resistance. And again, that's part of the next question that we'll be asking as we follow on sort of from this brainstorming around what other types of tools and resources could really help to embed a monitoring to learn strategy, is then thinking about what are some of the challenges and what are some of the issues to enable that as well too. So looking at some of the feedback that we've received here, again, picking up, I think, as you had mentioned before, Michaela, thinking about the communication, so spreading the knowledge, looking at some, I guess, a standard set of metrics that could be used as well too, whether that be within the patient community, within industry, or even from a regulatory and HTA perspective.
Looks to me like there's definitely some overlap between some of the different buckets here, the different squares. What is important to industry may also be equally as important to patient organizations. Absolutely, Barry. And can you pull out one of those examples just as is there something that stands out in particular? Yeah, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart, is the kind of having some sort of a report system, like a dashboard I think somebody put up in there, that a patient group and a and industry partners could share to demonstrate progress on a collaboration that they may be involved in. I think that provides everyone with real-time feedback and allows for adjustment of their strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, building on, I think, a little bit of what Michaela and perhaps Paula mentioned as well, and Ananda as well too, about the importance of that communication and really being able to share the information as well. Certainly looking at communication and that transparency, that open communication as certainly some of the criteria that are important for patient engagement as well too. Just looking at some of the other comments here.
Hayley, is it all right to come in? Because
yes, absolutely, Paula, please do.
One of my observations is it's really good to see, because it's some of the trajectory that we're already going on. So centralization of the monitoring evaluation results on an open platform. So we're hoping to embed this in Synapse. We've already got the book of good practice. If we can start to align that with all of this, we've then got those examples and hopefully the templates and things that we can do. And actually, if there is an agreed core set of metrics, that's exactly what we want to build into every initiative in Synapse. So we can start to see how that's changing the ecosystem and how people are showcasing what they're doing.
Absolutely, yes. Some great examples there, Paula. And for those people that may not be familiar with Synapse, it is a digital platform, sort of a patient engagement, networking, and mapping tool. And perhaps we can share the link in the chat there, where there's any number of resources, trainings, initiatives, people, organizations that are involved with patient engagement. And so really a great opportunity to align and an opportunity to think through some of those standard sets and how we could be able to do some analysis with that as well too. And in the interest of time, we'll move on to the second question, because I know we've had a few comments as well about this in some of the chat and some of the Q&A as well. And that's thinking about if we were to follow through with the resources and tools that were just suggested and some ideas that were just put forward in terms of further tools and resources, as we think about either implementing some of those or developing them further, embedding them within organizations, what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the issues that would be that either industry or the patient community or other stakeholders might face in terms of furthering the integration of those tools and resources? So this is where I mentioned, and perhaps Ananda, we could come back to you here around the question about compliance. And somebody had raised the question there around a comment around what you had mentioned around some compliance issues that we need to be careful about as well. So perhaps you could touch on that for us at this point.
Yeah, sure, happy. I did write quite half a Bible into the chat box. But actually the point I wanted to make is that very often compliance and legal departments see their role as gatekeepers, as people who avoid risk for the company. And sometimes very slowly, you know, that that approach sneaks into the interaction from patient organizations or the patient community and the company, and it gets in the way to the point that that compliance and legal dictates what you can do and what you can't do. And I think, I mean, from experience, from the, you know, the guiding principles of WeCan, where PFMD was involved as well, we saw that sitting together with legal and compliance officers is a very good way of making them understand. I mean, you have to understand that some of these people have never seen a patient advocate in their life. They don't even know what we're trying to do. And so they, you know, it's very difficult to be the vehicle for protecting that relationship if you don't understand what we're trying to do. And so trying to bring them on board and making them understand what this is about and what we're trying to achieve, if you do that, I'm pretty convinced, or at least my hypothesis, you can make them part of the solution rather than, you know, having them as gatekeepers, so to say. So you actually give them a role of finding a way to get to that objective
Mm.
without, putting the company at risk or the patient community.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've just seen the comments back in chat now too, that totally agreeing with your comments about engaging with people earlier on in the process so that they can be part of the solution as well too. So certainly helping to address some of that. And perhaps Michaela or Barry, you might have some comments there as well around some of the challenges. What I'm seeing in the chat, or sorry, in the group map here is sort of some of the cultural resistances, around either industry, regulatory, thinking about these challenges that are being considered, or just sort of that roadblock in terms of furthering the idea behind some of the resources and tools as well too. So further suggestions or ideas there, maybe Michaela, I'll turn it to you first just to see if that's something that resonates with you in terms of what people are sharing in the group map.
It resonates, and I think the first question we need to ask ourselves on whose responsibility is it to educate compliance and legal, and I would say it's in the hands of the patient engagement teams. We can educate, we can partner, and my personal experience with that is extremely good. So I'm not saying that we haven't had hurdles and we're still facing challenges. At the same time, we do have an assigned ERC and legal partnership now. And whatever we do it together, and that really accelerates things sometimes. That's one. And the second piece, I think, and that's coming back to my comment on educating, we need to differentiate between input from patients, so from the outside to the inside in industry, as opposed to from the inside to the outside. Let's not forget that the majority of the legal and the compliance department have over many years mainly worked also with compliance topics on HCPs, where we push information out, which is very different to getting information in. And I think educating on that difference is one important thing, and partnering early and continuously is the second piece to success. So the experience that we've had is, since we are doing that, we actually have ambassadors and partners in legal and compliance. So they actually help us drive the cause forward.
Terrific. That's great. That's some really good suggestions. There's some practical ways that I think people listening today might be able to reflect on that within their own organizations. And Barry, just before I turn it over to you, again, in the interest of time, we'll just move on to the third question, which is, again, we've just talked about some of the challenges, but now thinking about what are some of the strategies or some of the ways that we could help to facilitate further the adoption of some of the tools and the resources. So as you've pointed out, Michaela, in terms of engaging with legal and compliance early on and continuously. Barry, I'd be interested in your thoughts now as well too, in terms of, as you saw at Edwards, or perhaps again from hearing the panelists today and the other work that you do, what other strategies or ways do you think that either individuals or teams, departments could be equipped to be able to ensure that some of the resources and tools are able to be used and picked up across the organization?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I think it's kind of a two-way, top-down, bottom-up kind of approach to things. One approach is that, to the degree that we as a community can work with our key stakeholders out there, let's say it's regulators, or even maybe someday it's investors, really try to have them in leadership send signals to our organizations that this is going to be rewarded when you do this type of stuff. This is something that we encourage. We're not going to punish you for it. Even from a regulatory perspective, maybe even incorporating into guidance documents that, or even maybe having to pass laws that provide safe havens for certain kinds of activities that currently may be perceived by our respective legal and compliance teams as being prohibited by regulators. Really making it clear that no, if you're engaging patients from this perspective, then it is okay for you to work with them directly, to pay them, to compensate them, or whatever. That's a longer road, but I think that top-down approach is important. And then on a bottom-up perspective, I think really having people ourselves, anybody who's here in the organization or in this meeting, take a metric or take a KPI or take something and try it out yourself. Try it on for size. Try it with your boss. Try it with your supervisor. Try it with your organization. I tried this before where I actually, it sounds a little nutso, but I heard about somebody on Twitter who did this, where each day they would actually post what were their key accomplishments for that day to the team. And my effort was to try to change the culture of our entire global team, and by leading by example, show that I'm willing to be accountable for my performance in a day. Sometimes that would even be I didn't get a lot done, but that's being transparent and being open and vulnerable. And so I think taking on that responsibility ourselves, and like I quoted Gandhi before, if you want to change the world, change yourself, and really try to see how we can emulate through example how we can be successful and be willing to take risk.
Yeah, absolutely, Barry. And I think that really lends itself to what we've talked about this being a monitoring to learn strategy. This is not a monitoring to police. This is not necessarily a monitoring to evaluate for the sake of evaluation's sake. This is really to increase that patient engagement intelligence and thinking more broadly about how we can, again, think about different stakeholders, different functions within organizations coming on board to be able to further support patient engagement as well too. Again, there's been some really interesting comments and input into this insight gathering in this group map. Again, in the interest of time, I know we often say this with the open forum sessions that we could discuss this all day long, but recognizing that we just have a couple of minutes left in this session, wanting to let our participants know that we will leave the group map open, so probably till the end of this week into early next week. And so if there are further comments or suggestions that people have, then please feel free to go back and make sure that your ideas are put forward. As we had mentioned right at the beginning of this session, this is really a great opportunity for us to hear more about from the different stakeholders, the different perspectives, what's really important and how do we move forward beyond just the metric selector, a fabulous tool in and of itself, but then how do we take that to the next level and really start to further engage at an organization, potentially at a sector level in terms of patient engagement and monitoring to learn as well too. So if we can go back to the slides now, please. And just in conclusion here, I think we've had some really great discussion. I thank the panelists very much, Ananda, Barry, Michaela, Paula, for your contribution to this session, but certainly in terms of the discussion as well too. You each brought some very unique perspectives and some great ideas. I know there's a number of questions in the chat and in the Q&A that unfortunately we weren't able to address, but we will do our best to follow up on that as well. I hope our audience has really had a chance to have that sneak peek of the metric selector and understand its positioning within a much broader and much larger monitoring to learn session as well too. So we look forward to following up, sharing the slides and recordings as well too. We'll move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so as we know, as we've mentioned a number of times, that the open consultation is available now. We will be sharing the link in the chat. And you will also be receiving an email later today that details everything about how you can access the metric selector and how you can provide the feedback as well too. So we really look forward to your thoughts and perspectives on this. And certainly this is a significant step forward in terms of being able to have an actionable operational tool that really builds on the solid work of Paradigm and those 87 metrics. So really looking forward to seeing the feedback and hearing the stories, as many of you have asked for as well, about the success behind some of the monitoring to learn initiatives. We also, on the next slide, we'd certainly welcome your feedback on this session as well too. So immediately after this, you will receive an email in your inbox, and we do ask you to just take a few minutes and provide some feedback for us. Very helpful for myself, for the panelists, but also as we prepare for other sessions as well too. And finally, moving on to the next slide, We also ask you to consider about our upcoming session tomorrow, where we have another open forum session looking from representatives from the FDA, from Digital Europe, and from other key organizations to really think about setting stakeholder expectations and mapping this within the digital health and data space as well. So look forward to your participation there. And I believe on the final slide, we have one more. Thank you again for everybody's participation. We look forward to your participation in future sessions, particularly in the session tomorrow. And we'll look forward, and hopefully we'll be able to link back again in terms of the progress that we're making with the monitoring to learn strategy as well. So thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening. And we look forward to speaking with you soon. Bye-bye.